Matthias. There's too many freaking people in here. Like, I'm getting confused. Matthias Cornelius. We'll call him Matthias. Had Vlad captured at this point, and no one knows why, because they were supposed to be working together against the Turks.
Right.
But Matthias captured Vlad and imprisoned him in Transylvania. And then he moves into Hungary. But I mean, he was taken to Hungary and held in captivity for 14 years. But it's not like he was in prison. While he was in captivity, in quotation marks, he owned 2 houses. So he was living on his own. He was basically, they said, he was treated like a noble of the court. So he had free reign, but the king always knew where he was. So he wasn't free to leave. He wasn't free to go and run Wallachia. He had to stay in Hungary with the king.
Yeah, he had them.
Right. And he was released in 1475 after King Stefan from Moldavia. He kind of petitioned King Matthias to let him go. So eventually he did let him go in 1475. So this is quite a few. This is 14 years later. And he finally married Justina, and he converts, and at this point he converts to Catholicism, and they think that he did that just to make the king of Hungary happy. He's like, oh, see, I'm Catholic now, so you don't have to worry about it. And this is also when he went to war against the Ottomans, and he had the support of Hungary this time, the full support, with armies and stuff. By November of 1476, he would retake Wallachia to be crowned the voivode, again, the prince. This is the 3rd time he was crowned prince in his life. At the end of the year, the Ottomans would take back Wallachia, and Vlad is said to have died fighting in this war against them. And what they did was after they killed him, they decapitated him, and they stuffed his head and sent it to Istanbul, and it was paraded around the city in celebration for days.
Not Constantinople. It was Istanbul.
It was Istanbul, not Constantinople. I know when I was writing it down, that song was in my head.
Song in your head.
Okay. So that was the end of Vlad Dracula. But now we get to get into the myth of Dracula. And I'm going to just start out by saying that it was said that he had a very strict moral code, and anybody who deviated from this moral code was punished. He liked to impale his victims by tying each of their legs to a horse and slowly forcing a stake through the body, beginning in the orifices.
No.
Yes.
No.
The anus, the vagina, or the mouth, depending on how bad he hated you. Making sure the stake wasn't too sharp.
Oh, he made it worse.
Yes, as to not cause a wound that was too rapidly fatal. And it said he would grease the end of the stake. He would oil it up.
Oh.
And we're talking a steak, not a stick. It's a steak. Oh. We're talking a post that you would make a fence from, that big around.
I don't like this.
Yes. Horrible. And then once sufficiently impaled, the stake would then be lifted upright, and the weight of the victim's body would then further impale them as they slowly slid down the stake. It would take hours and sometimes days for them to die. Isn't that awful? And then they'd just be left there forever, basically. He liked to just
rot off the pole.
Yes.
And my God.
He was extremely concerned with female chastity.
Oh.
And if he found any woman who was unchaste or strayed from her husband, he would have them impaled through the vagina on a red-hot stake.
What?
Yes, and he would sometimes cut off their breasts and sometimes force their men to eat the breasts.
No.
Yes. Especially if they were caught having an affair, then they would be... This is just myth. This is some of the things that you can find. You can find a lot of different myths about things that Vlad Dracula did. And that's just... And the whole forcing people to eat other people was a recurring theme with him. Like,
oh God,
he would capture, if he captured noblemen, he would sometimes cook the general and make all the men eat him afterward. Lovely things like that.
Good.
He is said to have boiled and roasted victims alive, cut off various body parts, limbs, noses, ears, and breasts, strangled, skinned, and burned victims alive, and exposed them to wild animals who would eat them alive.
Oh God.
Yeah.
It's like you have to laugh because I'm gonna cry.
I know, it's awful. And it was also said that he would have the bodies of his victims, particularly those he had impaled, arranged in geometric patterns. So to make art with the corpses when he was done.
Great.
Yeah.
No,
that one I only read in one spot, but I thought it.
I like a little macabre art. That's not my thing. That wouldn't be my thing. I'm sorry.
No. And one of the tales that I read about, it was like, it said it happened, they called it the Bloody Easter in 1459. It was supposed, it's like when he summoned all the boyars and nobles to a meal at his palace, and there was about 500 of them there. And it said after they were done eating, he asked them each, one at a time, how many voivodes have ruled before him? So he says to one, how many of the voivodes were here before that you remember from before me? And all of their answers would range from numbers between 7 and 50. And having asked all of them this question, he nods his head. It's as I thought. Then he gets up, he gives an order to his guards, and all of the men there were all eventually impaled and stuck around the royal palace. So it's like he was tired. He's like, I'm going to get rid of all of this problem right now. If I have them all killed, then I don't have to worry about them later. 500. They said they range from old men to young men of the age of 14.
So he's like, oh, well, if they're all dead, they can't get me out of power.
Yes.
Right?
He's also claimed to have eradicated poverty in Wallachia. And he did this by inviting all the beggars of Targoviste to a fabulous feast, where after they were done eating, he locked them in a room and set it on fire.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, that's one way around. Kill everyone. There's more for everyone else, and then you don't have any beggars anymore because they're dead.
And there's a lot of tales about him, like people coming to visit, like people, like tradesmen who would come and would have a bag full of gold coins, and they would say, where can I keep these coins for the night? And they'd be like, oh, you can just keep them on your horse. No one will touch them. And he didn't believe them, but he did it anyway. And he would come down the next day and the bag of coins was still there because these people were so afraid of what would happen.
Right.
If they stole that they didn't steal. I guess his horrible plan did what he wanted. Isn't that awful?
Oh, it's terrible. And you think about it, like, you just think about politics in general and people in power, how they can make the numbers work for them. And it's just like a prime example of someone in power saying, I got rid of all the poverty. Yeah, because you killed everyone. Wow.
Yeah, I know. And it said, too, that when he was, in quotation marks, imprisoned by the Hungarian king, that he didn't want to forget how to torture people, so he would practice his impalement on rats and cats and mice and stuff that he would catch, and he would torture them. He'd skin them alive and impale them on little sticks.
Horrible man.
He's terrible. Oh, there's more. There's a few more stories I have.
Oh,
I'm not done.
I was hoping there was more grotesquerie.
Oh, it's not done. No. Okay, so after a failed coup from a Transylvanian ruler, one by the name of Dan II, he might have been Moldavia. There were so many names, and they were all the same, and they just had numbers after them. It's like a whole loop. My brain is like mushy. He ordered all the Saxon women and any other woman who had harbored the enemy to be impaled. And if they had infants or small children, they were killed and sewn to their breasts.
No!
After they were impaled. Isn't that horrible?
Oh, that's terrible!
This man was awful.
What is in his head?
awful. I guess somebody was asking him why, when he would go to a city and conquer it, why would he kill everybody in the city, not just the men? And he said, well, all those, he said something of like, if you have a stubborn weed, you don't just chop the top off the weed. You have to pull the weed out by the roots. He goes, these little ones are the roots. Isn't that awful? This is horrible. This is why you don't want your kids listening to this episode, because it's absolutely terrible. When he invaded the Barca region, he destroyed everything in the Saxon town of Brasov. He ordered all the prisoners that they caught impaled, and they were placed around the chapel of St. Jacob at the bottom of the mountain. And then after all the prisoners were impaled, he sat down at a table and ate his dinner amongst the dying impaled people. That was another story. Yeah, let's have dinner. It was hard work.
Yeah, well,
all those.
That's how I like to end pillaging and plundering
into
a nice meal.
Villagers. These were just villagers that were taken prisoner, and then he's like, "Oh no, we don't keep prisoners." And then they impaled them all, and then he sat down and ate dinner. Yep. After regaining his power, he captured all. This is for the second time, I think, when he was reinstated the second time, which was his longest reign. He captured all the boyars and nobles that helped to overthrow and kill his father and brother. And he marched them to Poneri Castle, which was a local castle, where they were made to rebuild it. So, he took all these noblemen and women who are of noble birth, and they were all the ones that turned on his father and his brother, and he had them march to this castle, this ruined castle on the top of this mountain, and made them rebuild the castle for him.
Wow.
So they died.
People that don't know how to do anything.
Right. But I think he had three major castles built or rebuilt while he was during his reign. That was his thing. And this Poneri Castle, I think is the one that's literally on the top of a mountain. And it's hard to get to. And it was hard to get the stones up there to build it.
Right.
It's literally on a mountaintop. Yeah. He was, another time, because it keeps going. And I didn't even write down all of the different stories that were about him. I just wrote down the really horrible ones.
Oh, good.
Yes. This is the last one I have. It said that he was offended when emissaries from the Ottoman Sultan wouldn't remove their turbans in his presence. He says to them, "Why are you insulting me by not removing your hat? Well, we don't even remove this for the Sultan. It's our religion. We have to keep this on our head."
Right.
And so he had their turbans nailed to their heads. Yes.
Oh,
and
God.
then, of course, they did not survive that. And then he chopped their heads off and sent them back to the Sultan.
Oh, good. That's a good way to get what you want, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, you're
not going to take them off? I'll stick them to your head with nails.
Nail them on. But yeah, that was the wonderful, happy, uplifting story of Vlad Dracula. And I mean, Bram Stoker in the late 1800s, when he wrote the book Dracula, it is said he did use Vlad Dracula as his inspiration for the character of Dracula in the book.
Right.
And I know that the Justina was his second wife, and there's not a lot known about his first wife. But a lot of the stories say that she that high mountain on the hill, on the top, that castle, Poneri Castle, was on top of the mountain. It was surrounded on all faces. It was a mountain, and then down the cliff there was a stream bed. It is said that on his retreat, during his second reign, when he was ruling for the second time, that during his retreat, she jumped from that castle. He retreated from the castle, and they were safe, but they couldn't leave the castle because they would have been captured. And she got so depressed that she flung herself from the battlements of the castle into the bed. Yes. And a lot of sources